In the following video, we will assess whether or not Russia will be the next world superpower. Now, the one thing everyone notices about Russia on first glance is its gigantic size, being the largest country in the world in terms of landmass, stretching from the Eastern European plains to the Pacific Ocean. This covers a grand total of 11 time zones. Now, most of the population resides on the European side, west of the Ural Mountains. This area is home to the ethnic Russian people. Like many people in Eastern Europe, ethnic Russians speak a Slavic language, just as the Poles and the Czechs do. They are also famed for their lax definitions of non-alcoholic beverages. Much of Western Russia has a humid continental climate with relatively warm summers and cold winters, although not quite as bad as what you'd see in the East. Despite Eastern Russia's vastness and beauty, it's really the West where the vast majority of the action occurs. However, the issue is that the heartland is located on the Eastern or Central European plain, and it makes it immensely vulnerable to attacks due to the lack of natural barriers, and this will be a recurring theme throughout the video. After all, this region is where nearly all the major population centers are, such as Moscow, St. Peter's, Volgograd, among others. In other words, the political, economic, and cultural centers of the country all reside in this one quarter of a nation. In early 2020, the nation held the 9th largest population and 11th largest economy. Given the birth rate in Nigeria, who knows how long this will last, and chances are it will shrink and fall down the line. Ethnic Russians are the majority, making up 4/5 of the national population, and hold most of the positions of political and economic power. Other major ethnic groups include Ukrainians, Belarusians, Tatars, Chechens, Armenians, Jews, and various indigenous peoples of Siberia. The southeastern portions of the country, oftentimes labeled as the Caucasus, are arguably the most contentious. This region includes areas like Chechnya and Dagestan, two Muslim-majority areas with strong separatist movements. Another highly contentious region is Crimea, which Russia stole from Ukraine in 2014, which was widely condemned by most of the international community. But Russia has defended its action by pointing out that there is a large population of ethnic Russians on the peninsula. This small region is of key geopolitical importance due to its warm water port. This is in sharp contrast to Russia's other ports in the Baltics or the Arctic Sea or even the Pacific, which freeze over the winter time. Having a Black Sea port gives Russia naval and maritime access throughout the year. Speaking of freezing temperatures, we have to get to Siberia. Now, technically, Siberia only refers to the Siberian Federal District, which covers the middle third of what we colloquially refer to as Siberia, but I'm just going to use the common vernacular term of Siberia, which refers to pretty much all of Russia east of the Ural Mountains. The northern portions of Siberia are covered in polar desert, but further south lies tundra and then boreal forests. This land is abundant in key natural resources such as timber, stone, zinc, coal, lead, gold, and most of all, natural gas. Nonetheless, this region is sparsely populated, and the main lifeline is the Trans-Siberian Railroad, bridging Moscow all the way to the Pacific. There are even some connecting lines to China, Mongolia, and North Korea. So that's the basic geography of Russia. But in order to better understand the country, we have to really look at its history. Russia is a relative newcomer on the world stage when compared to China, India, and the Middle East. The closest thing resembling a complex society in the region was the Kievan Rus, or the Kievan Rus, based in Ukraine. This was a mix between Viking culture, who had set up trading posts throughout many of the rivers, and the Slavic peoples, along with some Eurasian steppe peoples, becoming the foundation of what we now know as the capital city of Ukraine. It's interesting to see how ethnic and national identities morph. Ukrainian and Russian identities stem from the same medieval culture, despite the deep distrust and disdain for each other today. Around this time, people ditched worshipping the inspiration of Marvel superheroes and the Slavic gods for Orthodox Christianity. This would create a cultural binding to the predominantly Greek Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantines. The main reason why they chose Christianity over Islam is because Islam forbade alcohol, the fluid that flows through every Russian's veins. Kiev's glory days did not last forever as the Mongols eventually came in, doing what they did best, pillaging and mass murdering. You know, the usual. Even though the Mongols were brutal during warfare, they were fairly lenient rulers so long as they got their tribute. In return for giving them tribute, the Mongols reciprocated by promising not to burn down entire cities and villages. What a great deal. This deal would not last long, as the Principality of Moscow would arrive on the scene, gaining power and eventually defeating the Mongols. The Duchy of Moscow would then expand to become the Tsardom of Russia. The Tsardom of Russia continued to expand its power across the region with an iron fist, so bad that oftentimes it made the Mongols look like the nice guys. Look up Ivan the Terrible if you want more information on that. During the 1700s, Peter the Great renamed the Tsardom of Russia into the Russian Empire. He sought to westernize the nation, adopting more advanced technology, progressive policies, and even legislating men's facial hair. He also placed a tremendous amount of focus on building the city of St. Petersburg, using Russia's massive manpower. He also fought wars with Sweden and Poland-Lithuania. Side note, Poland would not survive this, and Poland getting screwed over is going to be a recurring theme. He also sent explorers past the Ural Mountains, quickly taking over the native Siberian lands with the use of guns, germs, and steel. This led to the near destruction of indigenous peoples and cultures, similar to what happened in the Americas and Australia. Eventually, the Russian Empire would stretch all the way to Alaska. Catherine the Great would come onto the scene to modernize the empire further, setting up Russia as a great power, before dying on the toilet. Fast forward a bit later, and Napoleon decided to invade Russia. It didn't go out as planned. Earlier in this video, I mentioned how Russia is vulnerable to attacks from Europe due to its location on the Eastern European plain. On face value, this would mean that Russia is easy to invade. Well, that's if you forget to consider Russia's size and its brutal winters. The French captured Moscow and set it on fire before ditching it without a peace treaty, or any sort of major reward in fact. They just took a long walk back to Paris, in which a fifth of their forces died. Let that be a lesson for any potential tiny mustached man. Fast forward, and Alexander II, known as Alexander the Liberator, would free the serfs and eventually sell Alaska to the United States, fearing that Britain would take it. He clearly lacked psychic abilities to predict future Russia-US relations. Most importantly, he freed the serfs and promoted local self-governance, but nonetheless was assassinated. His death would later be used by future Russian leaders as to why you don't give the populace too many reforms and rights. In comes Tsar Nicholas. One of his early accomplishments was managing to get his ass handed to him by the Japanese Navy. Here's a tip of advice for any would-be admirals. Ships made out of steel are a lot better than ships made out of wood. Nonetheless, he would eventually ally with Britain and France against the growing powers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Germans, and the sickly Ottoman Turks. Tsar Nick was too stupid to realize that maybe, just maybe, it's not a good idea to start a massive war while there's massive civil strife at home. And lo and behold, the Communist Revolution, led by Lenin, took hold. This would result in the end of the Russian Empire and the creation of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Lenin would eventually take control, and the Tsar and his family would be killed by firing squad. Although I heard that Disney made a good movie about one of the daughters surviving, allegedly. They would settle for peace with the Central Powers. Vladimir Lenin would eventually die, as we all do, and would eventually get replaced by this evil fuck, who would purge millions of his own people and send them to collectivist farms, factories, and Siberian work camps. Stalin, as many of you know him, did this to modernize Russia into an industrial power, which kind of worked, if you overlook all the mass murder, psychological terror, and gulags. Stalin would sign a non-aggression pact with Hitler and also purge much of his army command, which would result in a serious lack of experience and skill in the Soviet military, which would become a major problem in the coming years. And, well, you know what? It turned out that Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact, and they both invaded Poland. The Germans eventually invaded the Soviets as well. Poor little Stalin. The Soviets suffered massive casualties, both civilian and military, at the hands of the Yazidis. I'm not going to call them by their real name because the YouTube algorithm doesn't like that. Nonetheless, the Soviets managed to defeat the Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad. The Soviets would then roll through much of Eastern Europe, taking over German-occupied lands, and eventually leading to the tiny mustache man himself dying in a grease fire. I got that last part from Eddie Izzard. You might want to check the accuracy on that part. The Soviets ran through most of Eastern Europe, installing puppet governments. One major exception to this was Yugoslavia, another predominantly Slavic state that was highly religiously diverse. They independently kicked out the Germans through the leadership of Tito. This gets messy later on. After the Germans were defeated, the former alliance between the Soviet Union and the Americans would devolve into a worldwide coup and proxy war spree known as the Cold War. But neither of them engaged in any hot war, as both of them had developed nuclear weapons. And it turns out that destroying all life on Earth just isn't worth it for an argument between the merits of capitalism and communism. Although at some point we did come pretty close. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union would eventually loosen some of its social and economic restrictions. At this point, it had already been suffering due to a failed invasion of Afghanistan. At the end of the day, these reforms ended up leading to the unraveling, and the Berlin Wall fell. Many of the Soviet-aligned states broke off and eventually joined the EU and eventually NATO. For the time being, the Russian Federation would undergo fairly friendly relations with the West. However, at the same time, the country would undergo massive economic pain through the use of shock therapy policies and the rise of oligarchs. Tensions were also flaring up in the Balkans again, and the Russian president at the time, Boris Yeltsin, was too shit-faced on vodka to realize. Tensions would further decline with the West as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would intervene in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia would eventually break off into several nations, and Bosnia would be hit the hardest. NATO would intervene to stop Serbian nationalists in Bosnia from mass murdering Muslim Bosniaks. This bothered Russia, as many Russians saw Serbians as their loyal Slavic little brothers. Oh, and right on New Year's Eve in 1999, Vladimir Putin, a former KGB operative, became the president. Putin would eventually engage in the Second Chechen War. He would strengthen the Russian economy. He would occupy parts of Georgia and strengthen his occupation of Moldova. And in 2014, he would eventually steal Crimea from Ukraine and then engage in a full-blown invasion in 2022. Now for the analysis. As stated before, Russia's main Achilles heel is its location on the Central European plain. This flatland provides very little in terms of physical geographic barriers to protect Russia's heartland. To this day, this continues to make Russia's main political and economic centers vulnerable to enemy attacks from the West. And history has shown that Russia's concerns have been for a good reason. Napoleon invaded Russia for the official purposes of liberating Poland from the threat of Russia, although this was pretty much BS. A century later and a half, this semi-professional painter decided that he could do better. The Germans sought to take over wide swaths of what are now Russia, to enslave the Slavic population to provide food for an ever-growing Germanic population. The Russians and the Soviet people in general were clearly not thrilled about becoming slaves for some farmer fantasy. By the way, fun fact and sad fact, despite this history, Russia and Ukraine actually hold some of the largest neo-Nazi subcultures, not realizing that the guy with the tiny mustache really wanted to kill their great-grandpappy. During both invasions, Russia was nearly conquered, yet saved by its geography. Because of this predicament, Russia has always sought spheres of influence. This came usually in the form of puppet states that did the bidding of Moscow, or just conquering and subjugating various groups of people and forcing them under your own governmental affairs. The latter understandably causes far more resentment, although the former isn't that great either. During the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union installed allied governments in numerous Eastern European states, setting up the Warsaw Pact as well, which was a defense pact which was a response to NATO, the Western Alliance in Western Europe, as well as the US and Canada. But after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, this buffer zone disintegrated and the Warsaw Pact collapsed. Many countries in Eastern Europe had thrown off the yoke of Russian imperialism and had joined the EU and NATO. These included Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, also known as Czechia, Hungary, and others. NATO membership also expanded into former Soviet states, including Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Some of these countries border Russia, and if Russia were to invade Estonia, this would evoke Article 5 of NATO, which states that an attack on one is an attack on them all. This would be the most likely scenario of war between Russia and the West, although who knows what's going to happen with Trump as president. Now keep in mind that Russia sees NATO expansion as an incursion on their supposed buffer zone and a threat to national security. However, many Eastern European nations in NATO see their alliance as a protective measure against potential Russian aggression. Some other nations, namely Georgia and Ukraine, have sought NATO membership in the past, and both of them have been occupied by Russia to varying degrees. Russia oftentimes supports separatist groups of ethnic Russians in many of these nearby countries. For example, in Crimea, Russia had pulled its troops to steal the territory from Ukraine as they wanted a warm water port in the Black Sea. They conducted a referendum in which 97% of the voters of Crimea were in favor of leaving Ukraine and integrating with Russia. However, much of the international community rejects this, pointing out to Russian interference in the referendum, along with the relatively low turnout from ethnic Ukrainians and Tatars, which saw it as a farce. It's also worth noting that when the USSR collapsed, Ukraine did hold a number of Soviet nukes. Under international pressure to avoid nuclear proliferation, Ukraine handed over the nukes to Russia. This handover was highly reluctant given the history between the two countries. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians complied, on the condition that Russia would respect their sovereignty. Spoiler alert, this was a total bullshit assurance. Now, I'm going to avoid doing a deep dive into the current conflict as it's ongoing, and what I say now could change within a month, or perhaps even less than a month. Nonetheless, I think that we all know that the invasion of Ukraine so far has been a strategic disaster for Russia, but how much of a strategic disaster it will be is still up for debate. It's clear that Putin grossly underestimated the capability and nationalism of the Ukrainian people, long oppressed by Moscow. Ukraine has put up a formidable force. With the backing of Western weaponry and sanctions, they have certainly put up quite a fight, but whether or not this will be good enough to maintain their independence is another matter. Large swaths of Russia's intelligentsia and cultural ties have fled to the West, whereas many of the oligarchs with ties to Putin have seen their assets cut off. It is too early to tell how this will come to fruition, but for better or for worse, Russia is clearly becoming a bit of a pariah state, more interwoven with autocratic states like China and less interwoven with the West, resulting in more likely less technological power and a dwindling economy. On top of that, China, by virtually every metric at this point, is more powerful than Russia, making Russia on the path to becoming a vassal state. Now, going back to nuclear weapons, Russia relies on them in the event of a war with NATO. Russia would be highly unlikely to win in the long run using conventional warfare. Even if there were to be a war in which the US backs out due to the Trump administration, the combined might of many European countries and their allies would probably likely lead to Russia being defeated and pushing them back to their borders. Now, despite these advantages, Russia still has a tremendous amount of strategic depth, more than any other nation. Siberia's massive landmass and resources proved to be a lifeline during World War II, and it would play a similar role in the outbreak of another conflict, provided a tremendous amount of resources and manpower. Speaking of resources, the biggest degree of leverage Russia has is with its natural gas exports, much of which comes from Siberia. This is part of the reason why Germany is oftentimes at odds with Russia's foreign policy, but is oftentimes less likely to engage in sanctions compared to the UK or Canada. South of Russia lies Central Asia. This region oftentimes is considered to be irrelevant on the global stage due to being landlocked, having a relatively small population, weak economies, and militaries. Most of these nations in the region are autocratic to varying degrees and are deeply interwoven into global corruption networks. This area was once taken over by the Russian Empire during its rivalry with the British. These were semi-autonomous subregions or states of the USSR, but after the Soviet Union collapsed, it led to 5 successor states that are independent, oftentimes led by former Communist Party officials. Furthermore, there has been some rivalry between Russia and China in Central Asia, and it'll be interesting to see if this will cause fissures down the line. Russia's relationship with China is highly complex. At one point, they were largely aligned as communist nations from the late 40s to the 60s, but they eventually had a breakup over who was more communist. But relations nonetheless improved during the 1980s. The two nations are massive nuclear-armed Eurasian powers. After the USSR collapse, relations between the two countries have been closer. The two countries have had deep economic, military, and political ties, as well as strong opposition to Western influence, particularly when it comes to Western military intervention. Russia also maintains fairly close ties with North Korea. However, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, China has taken a far larger role than Russia as the main ally of North Korea. However, this is changing as now North Korean soldiers are fighting alongside Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Russia also continues to hold territorial disputes with Japan. Disputes have been ongoing since World War II. Come on, guys, you've had like 70 years. Japan is deeply intertwined with those of Western nations and by and large does not like Russia. On top of that, Japan is also a major adversary of China, Russia's ally. However, unlike the Atlantic, the Pacific doesn't hold any sort of formal alliance with the United States. So many of the US relationships to counter China and Russia by and large are bilateral. Let's move on to Russia's ties to the Middle East. Russia used to maintain very close ties to Syria, and held and quasi still holds a naval and air base, although this is still up for debate and there's quite a lot of controversy at the moment. This is because the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, which was backed by Moscow, was eventually overthrown by Turkish-backed rebels, just in the end of 2024. Russia had played a critical role backing up Bashar al-Assad during the Syrian civil war. However, due to Russia being caught in a quagmire in Ukraine and Bashar al-Assad's other ally, Iran, being humiliated by Israel, many anti-Assad groups eventually coalesced their forces and removed Bashar al-Assad from power in a matter of 11 days. Russia has now moved to putting more focus on its attention to a military base in Libya, oftentimes in an attempt to counter Turkish influence. And on top of that, Russia has also forged stronger ties to Iran, as Iran has been giving Russia many Shahad drones to bomb Ukrainian utilities. On top of that, Iran is also vigorously anti-Western. Now let's move on to another region that is oftentimes overlooked, and that is the Arctic, where Russia holds the most undisputed geopolitical clout relative to other powers. Oftentimes mistaken as a forsaken frozen hellhole, the Arctic is abundant with natural resources such as oil, natural gas, iron, copper, and I guess seal pellets as well. As anthropogenic climate change raises global temperatures, the Arctic is bound to change its topography and ecosystem drastically. While all biospheres from coral reefs to deserts are bound to change due to rising temperatures, it's the polar regions where the visible change will be the most obvious. A slight rise in temperatures will cause ice to melt during the summer. During the Age of Exploration, many English and Dutch sailors sought to find the Northwest Passage to this area. These expeditions pretty much were epic fails, but today, with the ice gone for long periods of time, this allows for the passage of cargo ships, resource extraction, and military operations in the region. The 5 major Arctic nations are Russia, Norway, Denmark, look at Greenland, Canada, and the United States, look at Alaska. Of the 5, Russia holds the largest presence by far, with the largest population in the region and the most prevalent levels of military activity. Part of this is due to Russia's identity as an Arctic nation, one that is probably only rivaled by Canada. The US, on the other hand, is rather uninterested in the affairs of the Arctic, at least so far. Like many Eastern European nations, Russia's population is slightly declining. While this has been a recovery since the 1990s when the population was dropping more drastically, it's not particularly good news either. Despite the continued demographic challenges, Russia's economy has improved since the collapse of the Soviet Union, or more accurately, since the collapse of the Russian economy after the collapse of the Soviet Union during the 90s. Russia's economy is oftentimes ranked in the top 15, although this is quickly changing as smaller countries like Canada and Italy have larger economies. Russia's economy is also highly dependent on raw materials and processed natural resources such as oil and gas. This makes them very vulnerable to the fluctuation of prices for hydrocarbon resources. There's also a relative lack of consumer goods that were exported from Russia. Most people living outside Russia or in nearby nations would be hard-pressed to name any Russian products that weren't a form of alcohol or a firearm. Speaking of firearms, one of the few types of consumer goods that are bought frequently abroad are weapons, if you could call them consumer goods. Russia has one of the most technologically advanced weapon systems in the world, and they're the second biggest exporter after the United States. This gives them considerable geopolitical leverage, selling arms to friendly nations like, say, Venezuela, as well as some neutral nations like India. In the aftermath of the initial failed invasion of Ukraine, however, I do think many countries are going to move away from purchasing Russian weapons and transition into purchasing more advanced Western or perhaps even Chinese weapons. Now let's move on to Russia's political system. Russia is an autocracy. It does fairly poorly when it comes to free speech, freedom of the press, LGBT rights, and by and large is known as an authoritarian regime. While Western nations allying with autocratic regimes like Saudi Arabia doesn't tend to bat an eye, the presence of a great power like Russia, ruled by an authoritarian regime, does cause a great deal of concern. If Russia one day genuinely does become democratic, it would most likely assuage some of the ill will between the West and Russia, as major powers tend to bond the closest with nations with similar systems of government. This is part of the reason why Russia and China cooperate. However, the relationship between China and Russia is not necessarily an alliance, but more of a partnership of friends. China also has a larger population and economy, so any formal alliance would make Russia the bottom in this marriage. Many Russians are also critical of the Russian government's open policy to Chinese immigration, and some even fear that Eastern Siberia will resemble China culturally and demographically as more immigrants arrive there. Some even fear a political union between the eastern portions of the country and China. Russia also holds ties with countries that have poor relations with China, such as Vietnam and India. Beijing also has not seen eye to eye with Russia on the subject of Georgia and the invasion of Ukraine, which generally speaking, China just sits on the fence, not necessarily supporting it. Nonetheless, Russia and China still continue to cooperate in Central Asia, but making a full-blown alliance against the West is unlikely. Many Russian elites have closer cultural and economic ties to the West than China. Many oligarchs and officials have homes and bank accounts in the West. Many of their children study in Western universities, and many spend their vacation in North America and Western European cities. Since elites play a major role in influencing Russian policy, this makes it less likely that Russia will go to a full-blown war with all of the West, or invade a NATO country. However, a war with Ukraine has changed many of these dynamics. After all, many of Russia's most educated people have fled to the West, seeking better opportunity and oftentimes protesting Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, many of the oligarchs have lost their assets in the West, further decoupling these two forces. This may result in Russia seeking greater ties with China and other autocratic nations, or worse, becoming a pariah state. Only time will tell. The most likely scenario is that it will forge stronger ties to China, North Korea, and Iran as a way of pushing back against the West. At the end of the day, I highly doubt Russia will emerge as some sort of superpower by the end of the century. I honestly think that it's unlikely to even remain as a great power. Sure, it will still have a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, and yes, a lot of nuclear weapons and a bunch of gas. But even as hydrocarbon resources may lead to a fading of power, as many countries switch to nuclear power and green energy. It's really not too good to rely purely on a bunch of dead plant matter under your feet. Russia's economy is actually smaller than Canada's. And as we see the Ukraine war slog on further, it's likely that more and more young men will die in the conflict. And many of Russia's most educated young people have already traveled abroad. This is a pretty damning set of affairs. Maybe there is room for optimism. Maybe perhaps after Putin croaks, there will be a new leader who is more pragmatic. However, I really don't know what the future will behold. I think the most likely scenario is that Russia is turning more into a middle power. It will still hold some regional sway, but by and large, the days of some grand Russian empire are finally coming to a close. So maybe, just maybe, and I could be totally wrong about this, Westerners don't have the best reason to fear Russia too much. Russia, at the end of the day, is rather unusual. Russia is a European nation that is not completely European. A developed nation that isn't completely developed. A nation that in many ways holds very similar cultural values as the West, but in many ways is very different. An entity that is separated from the West, yet not completely separate. And that makes it all the more fascinating.